The dust of the New Mexico territory tasted of grit and finality. It coated Eli Granger's tongue, settled in the creases of his leather duster, and clung to the sweat on his brow like a second skin. For 3 weeks, he had been breathing it, eating it, sleeping in it. It was the only constant companion in his hunt for Jedediah Kane, a man whose face was burned into Eli's memory like a brand on a calf. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Flint, plodded onward, its head low against the oppressive, sun-bleached sky. The town appeared first as a shimmer of heat, then a collection of warped wooden skeletons huddled against the vast, indifferent landscape. Tinder Creek, the name was fitting. The whole place looked like it was one stray spark away from turning to ash. It was the kind of town men like Kane disappeared into, a place where questions died of thirst before they could be answered. Eli swung down from the saddle, his joints aching with a weariness that went deeper than the trail. He tied Flint to a hitching post outside the saloon, the only building that showed any real sign of life. Its bat-wing doors sighed open and shut, spilling the sounds of tinny piano music and rough laughter into the suffocating quiet of the street. He didn't expect to find Kane here, it was too obvious, but a man needed a drink of something that was not thick with alkali, and information was often cheapest at the bottom of a whiskey glass. He pushed through the doors and stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. The air was heavy with the smell of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and the thin, sweet smoke of cheap cigars. A few prospectors hunched over a table in the corner, their faces hidden by shadow and grime. A bartender with a stained apron polished a glass with a rag that had seen better days. It was a place of ghosts and last chances, and Eli felt right at home. He ordered a whiskey, the amber liquid burning a clean path down his raw throat. He listened more than he looked, catching snippets of conversation about dry wells and lost cattle. Nothing about Jedediah Kane. He was about to turn and leave, to continue his lonely pursuit, when a shift in the room caught his attention. The bartender had disappeared through a door behind the bar, and a few of the other men, their eyes alight with a furtive, ugly sort of excitement, followed him. They were not loud about it. It was a secret they all seemed to share. Curiosity, a dull instrument in his soul these days, was sharpened by the scent of something foul. This was not the kind of gathering that ended in a simple card game. He finished his drink, the fire of it spreading through his chest, and moved toward the back of the saloon, his footsteps silent on the dusty floorboards. The door was not quite closed. Through the crack, he saw a scene that made the whiskey curdle in his stomach. It was a small, crowded storeroom, lit by a pair of smoking lanterns that cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. About a dozen men were gathered, ranchers and merchants by the look of their clothes, their faces slick with sweat and greed. On a makeshift platform built from stacked crates stood a man with a ledger, his voice a low, wheedling drone. And beside him stood a young woman, not much more than a girl. Her head bowed as she was bartered for. A strong back and no family to speak of, the auctioneer was saying. Willing to work for room and board, contract signed and legal for 5 years. Who'll start the bidding for this fine girl? $1? Can I get $1? Eli had heard whispers of these arrangements on the borderlands. They called them indenture contracts, a respectable name for selling human souls. They preyed on the desperate, the orphaned, the ones left behind by raids or sickness. He felt a cold rage begin to build inside him, a familiar and terrible fire. This was the rot that grew in the dark corners of the world, the same kind of evil that had taken everything from him. Another girl was sold for $2.50 to a rancher with cold, assessing eyes. She wept silently as she was led away. Then, the auctioneer cleared his throat and gestured for someone to be brought forward. And now, the last of the lot, a special case. This one. 2 men pushed her onto the platform. Her dress, a pale blue cotton that might have once been beautiful, was torn at the shoulder and stained with the dirt of a long and brutal journey. Her face was smudged with dust and streaked with dried tears, a dark bruise blooming high on her cheekbone. Her copper-colored hair was a tangled mess, escaping from a loose braid. But it was her eyes that held Eli captive. They were wide and hollow, filled with an emptiness that spoke of horrors he could well imagine. Yet, there was something else there, too. A flicker of defiance in the straight line of her jaw, in the way she stood tall despite the trembling in her hands. She refused to look at the men leering up at her. She stared at a point on the far wall, her focus so intense it seemed she might burn a hole right through the wood. "This is Cora Bellamy," the auctioneer announced, a smirk playing on his lips. "Daughter of a preacher, or so they say. She's quiet. Hasn't spoken a word since she was found." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried through the tense room. A little trail-worn, if you take my meaning. Some might call her damaged goods. A low chuckle went through the crowd. The men nudged each other, their comments just loud enough to be heard. Damaged is right. Bet the raiders had their fill of that one. Or maybe the lawmen who were rescued of her. Still, a pretty thing, if you can clean her up, might be worth $1 for housework. Eli's hand instinctively went to the Colt peacemaker at his hip. The feel of the worn walnut grip was a cold comfort. He watched Cora, saw her flinch at the words, a barely perceptible tightening of her shoulders. She was a statue of misery, but she would not break. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. "Well, what am I bid for this one?" the auctioneer asked, growing impatient. "She's young, strong enough for cooking and cleaning. Let us start the bidding at 50 cents. $1, a coarse voice called out. It came from a big man with a piggish face and hands like smoked hams. He was already picturing what he would do with her, and it was written all over his cruel face. $2, another man offered, a shopkeeper Eli recognized from the general store. The big man grunted, 2.25. The room was quiet for a moment. The price was low, a clear insult. Her silence, her supposed history, had made her worthless in their eyes. She was a broken thing to be bought for pocket change. $3, the big man finally boomed, looking around the room as if daring anyone to challenge him. He smiled, a sickening display of yellowed teeth. "Sold to me, then." The auctioneer raised his gavel. $3 it is, a bargain for a strong worker. Going once. The image of another woman's face flashed in Eli's mind. May, her laughter like wind chimes, her hands in his, then the smoke, the screams, the sight of her being dragged away while he was miles off, helpless. The guilt was a physical thing, a blade that twisted in his gut every single day. He had failed her. He had not been there. Going twice. He saw May's eyes in Cora's, the same terror, the same fight to hold on to the last shred of dignity. He could not save May, but this girl, this stranger with defiance in her bruised face, was right here. Sold for $3. Wait. Eli's voice was not loud, but it cut through the stale air like a shard of glass. Every head in the room turned toward him. He stepped out of the shadows, his tall frame filling the doorway. The dust of the trail was on him. The weariness of his quest was in his eyes. But there was something else there now, a cold, unyielding purpose. The auctioneer squinted at him. "You want to place a bid, stranger?" Eli's eyes never left Cora. He saw a flicker of something in her gaze, not hope, but a raw, startled confusion. He took a slow breath, the words forming not from his mind, but from a place of deep, aching grief. "I'll buy her with my life." A stunned silence fell over the room. The men stared, their mouths agape. It was not a bid. It was a testament, a declaration that made no sense in their world of coin and contracts. Then, before anyone could speak, Eli moved. With a fluid grace, he unbuckled his gun belt, the heavy leather, worn smooth with years of use, held his Colt in a row of brass cartridges. It was his trade, his defense, his only true possession of value. He laid it on a nearby table with a solid, definitive thud. Next, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. He untied the drawstring and emptied its contents onto the table beside the gun. A handful of silver dollars and a few smaller coins clattered and spun. A meager fortune that represented everything he had left in the world. "There," he said, his voice low and steady. "That is my bid. All of it." The auctioneer stared at the gun, then at the man. He saw the look in Eli's eyes, a look that promised violence without uttering a single threat. This was not a negotiation. It was the end of one. Eli did not wait for an answer. He walked straight to the platform, his boots making a heavy sound on the floorboards. The men parted before him as if he were a phantom. He reached the platform and held out a hand to Cora. She flinched back, her eyes wide with fear. She did not understand. She expected another monster, another captor. He let his hand drop. He would not force her. He simply stood before her, a silent guardian, and looked at the auctioneer. "She is with me now." He turned his back on the room, a profound act of trust and defiance, and stepped off the platform. He waited. After a long, agonizing moment, he heard the hesitant scuff of worn shoes behind him. Cora was following. He led her out of the storeroom, through the now silent saloon, and into the blinding afternoon sun. No one said a word. No one dared to stop him. The weight of his gun belt on that table held them all in place. Outside, the world seemed both too bright and too quiet. He untied Flint and led the horse a little way down the street, away from the prying eyes of the saloon. He stopped and turned to Cora. She stood there, looking small and lost, her hands twisting the fabric of her torn dress. She still would not meet his gaze. He moved slowly, not wanting to frighten her. He cupped his hands to offer her a step up onto the saddle. She hesitated, then, with a shaking breath, placed her worn boot into his hands. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing at all and set her gently onto the horse. She settled into the worn leather, her back ramrod straight. He swung up behind her, careful not to touch her more than was necessary to keep them both balanced. He could feel the rigid tension in her body, the fine trembling that she could not control. He picked up the reins, his knuckles brushing against her side. He leaned forward just enough for her to hear his whisper, his voice rough with disuse and emotion. "Hold on tight," he said softly. It was the first thing he had said directly to her. "I will not let you fall." He urged Flint into a steady walk, and then a canter, leaving the wretched town of Tinder Creek behind them. He did not look back. There was nothing there for him. Jedediah Kane would have to wait. The ghost of vengeance had been replaced by the solid, breathing weight of a life he now held in his hands. They rode until the sun began to bleed across the western sky, painting the clouds in hues of orange and deep purple. He found a small, sheltered spot in the curve of some low, rocky hills where a few stubborn junipers grew. He slid from the saddle and reached up to help her down. Her limbs were stiff, and she nearly stumbled as her feet touched the ground. He steadied her with a light touch on her arm and immediately let go. She did not run. She simply stood there, watching him with those same haunted eyes as he went about the familiar ritual of making camp. He unsaddled Flint, rubbing the tired animal down with a coarse blanket. He built a small, smokeless fire with dry wood, the flames pushing back the growing chill of the desert night. He filled a tin cup with water from his canteen and offered it to her. She took it with trembling hands, her fingers brushing his. Her skin was cold. She drank slowly, cautiously, as if expecting it to be snatched away. When she was done, she handed the cup back, her gaze fixed on the fire. She still had not spoken a word. Eli did not press her. Silence was a language he understood. He had lived with its cold comfort for years. He cooked a simple meal of bacon and beans, dividing it onto 2 tin plates. He set one down on a flat rock near her. She looked at the food, then at him, a question in her eyes. "Eat," he said, his voice gentle. "You need your strength." She ate, small, hesitant bites at first, then with a hunger that spoke of days of deprivation. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the lonely cry of a coyote in the distant hills. When they were finished, he cleaned the plates with sand and set them aside. He laid out his bedroll near the fire and motioned for her to take it. "You sleep here," he said. "I will take watch." She looked at the bedroll, then at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. He simply nodded and moved to sit with his back against a rock a little ways off, his rifle across his lap. He watched the stars begin to appear in the vast, dark sky, more stars than a man could ever count. He felt the weight of the day, the weight of his actions, settle upon him. He had bought a woman, he who had nothing, had paid everything. And for what? For a ghost, for a chance to quiet the screaming voice in his own soul. As the fire burned low, he allowed himself to look at her. She had wrapped herself in his bedroll, curled into a tight ball as if to protect herself from the world. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. In the flickering firelight, she looked impossibly young, impossibly fragile. And his mind, as it always did in the quiet hours of the night, drifted back. He was in a field of bluebonnets, the Texas sun warm on his face. May was weaving flowers into a chain, her laughter spilling out as the petals kept breaking. Her hair was the color of corn silk, and her eyes were the blue of that summer sky. She was life. She was every good and decent thing he had ever known. "You'll be late for the cattle drive?" "Eli Granger," she teased, her fingers working deftly. "Let them wait," he'd answered, leaning back on his elbows. "There is nowhere on this earth I would rather be." He had given her a promise ring that afternoon, a simple silver band he had traded a month's wages for. He had promised to build her a house, to protect her, to love her until his last breath. He had promised her a future. The memory soured, the blue sky turning to black smoke. He had been gone for 2 days, moving the herd to better pasture. When he returned, the world was gone. The homestead was a smoldering ruin. The bluebonnets were trampled and black with soot. A raiding party had swept through, taking what they wanted, destroying the rest. They had taken May. He found her days later, miles away, left in a shallow ditch like something discarded. The light was gone from her eyes. His promises had turned to ash in his mouth. He had failed. It was a simple, brutal fact that had governed every day of his life since. He had not been there to protect her. His life was forfeit that day. He had just been too stubborn to stop breathing. He looked back at the sleeping form of Cora Bellamy. The firelight softened the lines of her face, washing away some of the hardness and revealing the girl underneath. A preacher's daughter, someone who had once known lilacs and prayers, now reduced to a silent, bruised creature sold for $3 in the back of a saloon. He had failed May. He could never change that. But as he watched the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of Cora's chest, a vow formed in the deepest, most broken part of his heart. It was a quiet promise made to the stars, to the memory of a dead love, and to the living, wounded girl sleeping just a few feet away. He would not fail again. The days that followed blurred into a slow, silent rhythm of travel. Eli set a steady pace, pushing Flint through the arid landscape, but never to the point of exhaustion. He was aware, always, of the woman behind him. She was a silent presence, her body held stiffly, her hands clutching the back of the saddle with a grip that spoke of profound uncertainty. He never tried to make conversation, sensing that words were a currency she could not afford to spend. Instead, he offered small, practical kindnesses. He found the shadiest spots to rest during the high sun. He made sure she drank water before he did. He gave her the larger share of their meager meals. She accepted everything with a quiet, unnerving stillness. She never said thank you. She never met his eyes. When he looked at her, she would turn her head, her gaze fixed on the distant, hazy mountains. It was as if she were trying to make herself disappear, to become as silent and unnoticeable as the dust motes dancing in the sunlight. On the third day, they came upon a creek, a thin ribbon of life snaking through the cracked earth, shaded by a small grove of cottonwood trees. The water ran clear and cool over smooth stones. Eli dismounted and helped her down, his hands firm on her waist for only a moment before he let go. "We will rest here for a while," he said, his voice low. "The water is clean." He led Flint downstream to drink, deliberately giving her space. When he returned, she was standing at the water's edge, looking at her reflection. He saw her raise a hand to her bruised cheek, her fingers tracing the discoloration with a detached sort of wonder, as if it belonged to someone else. Then, with a sudden, decisive movement, she waded into the creek up to her knees. She cupped the cold water in her hands and began to wash her face, scrubbing at the grime with a desperate energy. Eli turned away, busying himself with checking the horse's hooves. He would not intrude on this private reclamation. He heard the splashing continue, and when he finally glanced back, she had unbraided her hair and was washing it in the stream, the tangled copper strands turning dark with water. It was the first act of self-care he had seen from her, a small but powerful signal that the girl who had been sold was not entirely gone. He rummaged through his saddlebags and found a small, worn comb he had not used in years. He set it on a flat rock near her discarded dress, then walked back to the horse, his back to her. He heard her leave the water, heard the soft rustle of cloth. A long time passed. When he turned around, she was sitting on the rock, her back to him, slowly, painfully working the comb through the wet tangles of her hair. The simple domestic sound of it was a strange counterpoint to the vast, wild silence of the territory. He noticed then how the chill of the evening was beginning to set in. Her dress was thin, offering little protection. He took off his heavy duster, the one that smelled of trail dust, leather, and him. He walked over and laid it gently on the ground beside her, not touching her, not speaking. Then he returned to his post by the fire he had built. A few minutes later, he saw her pull the coat around her shoulders, sinking into its warmth. She still avoided his eyes, but she had accepted a piece of his protection, of his care. It was a start. That night, huddled by the fire, she spoke for the first time since the saloon. Her voice was a mere whisper, dry and cracked, as if it had been locked away for an eternity. "Cora?" Eli looked up from the flame he was tending. He thought at first he had imagined it. She was staring into the fire, her face half hidden by the collar of his coat. "My name is Cora," she whispered again, so softly the wind nearly carried it away. Eli did not press her for more. He simply nodded. "Cora," he repeated, letting her name settle in the quiet space between them. "It is a good name." Later, just as the fire was burning down to embers and he thought she had fallen asleep, her voice came out of the darkness again, a ghost of a sound. "I had a brother, Samuel. He was younger." And then, nothing more. But the silence that followed felt different. It was no longer empty. It now held a name, and the memory of a boy named Samuel. The next night, she whispered of the lilacs that had grown by the porch of her father's house, how their scent would fill the rooms after a spring rain. Each whispered fragment was a precious stone pulled from the wreckage of her past, offered up into the vast, listening dark. They traveled for another week, a slow pilgrimage north. Eli was not heading toward any particular place, only away from the one they had left, but his mind kept returning to a patch of land his old friend, Silas, had left him. Silas had died of a fever the year before, and his letter had found Eli in a dusty Texas town, bequeathing him his small, struggling ranch near the Colorado border. "It ain't much," Silas had written in his clumsy script, "but it's a place to stand, and sometimes that's all a man needs." Eli had never intended to claim it. He was a hunter, a man defined by his quest for revenge. He had no use for roots. But now, with Cora, a place to stand sounded like the finest thing in the world. When they finally crested the last hill, the ranch lay below them in a shallow valley. It was as Silas had promised. Not much. A small, sturdy cabin of peeled logs, a sway-backed barn, and a broken-down corral. The land around it was overgrown with sagebrush and thistle, but a small creek, the same one that gave the valley its life, ran nearby. The place looked lonely, forgotten, but it was whole. It was still standing. Cora slid off the horse before he could help her, her feet landing solidly on the ground. She stood for a long time, just looking at the cabin. It was not a home, not yet, but it was 4 walls and a roof. It was a promise of shelter. The first few weeks were a delicate dance of shared space and unspoken boundaries. The cabin had only 1 room and a small loft. Eli immediately gave her the single cot in the corner, taking the loft for himself. He never entered the cabin without knocking softly first. He never watched her change. His respect for her was a quiet, constant thing, a shield he held up against the world and, perhaps, against himself. Cora, in turn, began to emerge from her shell of silence. She was still painfully quiet, but her actions spoke for her. She found a rusty bucket and scrubbed the cabin floor until the wood gleamed. She found a half-wild goat with a full udder wandering the property, a remnant of Silas's small herd, and after a patient hour, managed to coax some milk from it. She cooked for them, simple meals of beans, cornmeal, and whatever small game Eli could shoot. She found an old sewing kit in a dusty trunk and painstakingly mended the tear in her dress. She worked with a fierce, brittle energy, as if by keeping her hands busy, she could keep the memories at bay, but her body was not as strong as her will. More than once, Eli found her slumped over the table or sitting on the cabin steps, her face pale, her body racked with tremors from exhaustion. He would lead her gently to the cot, telling her to rest, and she would obey without argument, her energy spent. In these moments of rest, more of her story would surface. She told him her father had been a preacher in a small settlement to the south. He had preached kindness and forgiveness in a land that had little of either. One day, a band of outlaws, their faces masked by bandanas and their souls by greed, had ridden in. They had burned the church first, then the rest of the town. "They took everything," she said one afternoon, her voice flat and devoid of emotion as she stared out the newly cleaned window. "The survivors, they rounded us up. The men from the next town. They said they were helping. They said they would find us homes." Her hands clenched into fists in her lap. "They sold us." The brutal simplicity of it left no room for questions. Eli listened, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He now understood the full depth of the betrayal that had hollowed out her eyes. It was not just the outlaws who had destroyed her life, but the so-called decent men who had profited from her ruin. Their quiet life was interrupted one morning by the arrival of a rider. He was a tall man with a silver star pinned to his vest and a pair of shrewd, assessing eyes. Sheriff Brody, he introduced himself, from the county seat some 20 miles east. "Just making my rounds," he said, his gaze drifting from Eli to the cabin, and finally to Cora, who had frozen by the doorway. "Heard someone had taken up residence at the old Silas place." Eli stood calmly, his body positioned slightly in front of Cora. "The place is mine now. Silas was a friend." The sheriff nodded, but his eyes stayed on Cora. "And the lady?" he asked, his tone casual. But the question was not, "Family?" "She is with me," Eli said, his voice level. It was not an answer, but a statement of fact, a warning. Sheriff Brody dismounted, his spurs jingling in the quiet air. He was a man used to getting answers. "Folks get to talking," he said, leaning against the corral fence. "Word travels up from the territory. Word about a man who broke up a certain kind of auction in Tinder Creek, a man who walked out with a contract girl." He looked directly at Cora then. They say she was damaged. A runaway. Cora flinched as if struck. All the color drained from her face. She took a step back, into the shadows of the cabin. Eli's voice, when he spoke, was dangerously soft. The only thing damaged in that town, Sheriff, was the souls of the men who were there. And she is not a runaway. She is free. Freedom costs. Granger, Brody countered, his eyes narrowing. Everything has a price. I have to wonder what yours was. And what you expect in return. The insinuation was ugly and clear. Eli took a step forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply let the cold fury in his eyes speak for him. You came here to ask your questions. You have asked them. Now you can ride on. Do not come back here to trouble her again. If you have business, you have it with me. The two men stared at each other for a long moment. A battle of wills played out in the still morning air. The sheriff was a man of the law, but Eli was a man with nothing left to lose, and Brody was smart enough to see the difference. He finally pushed himself off the fence, a flicker of something that might have been respect, or perhaps just caution. In his eyes, "Just doing my job," he said gruffly. He swung himself back into his saddle. "But you watch yourself. Granger, a man cannot stand against the whole world." He tipped his hat, a gesture that was more of a dismissal than a courtesy, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy silence in his wake. Cora remained in the doorway, a pale statue of fear. Eli turned to her, his own anger dissolving into a wave of concern. He took a step toward her, but she turned and fled into the darkness of the cabin. That night, the silence was different. It was thick with unspoken fear. Eli lay in the loft, listening to the sounds of the night, but his senses were tuned to the woman below. He heard her turn on the cot, the rustle of the thin blanket, and then he heard it, a small, choked sound, a sob she was trying to smother in her pillow. It was a sound of absolute heartbreak, of a dam of unshed tears finally breaking. He could not leave her alone with that kind of pain. He climbed down the ladder, his bare feet silent on the wooden floor. In the pale moonlight filtering through the window, he could see her shoulders shaking. He knelt by the side of her cot. He did not know what to say. Words were useless against such a profound grief. So he did the only thing he could. He reached out and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. She went rigid at his touch, a gasp catching in her throat. But he did not move away. He just kept his hand there, a steady, warm pressure. After a long moment, she turned, and the sobs broke free, raw and ragged. She curled into herself, weeping for her father, for her brother Samuel, for the lilacs, for the girl she used to be. Without thinking, Eli sat on the edge of the cot and gathered her into his arms. She was small and trembling, but she did not pull away. She buried her face in his shirt and cried until she had no tears left, her small body shuddering with the force of her sorrow. Eli just held her. He did not speak. He did not soothe her with empty platitudes. He simply held her, absorbing her pain, offering his own solid presence as an anchor in her storm. It was the first time they had truly touched, an embrace born not of passion, but of shared humanity in the face of unbearable loss. He held her for what felt like hours, until the last of her shudders subsided and her breathing deepened into the slow, even rhythm of exhausted sleep. He laid her gently back down on the pillow, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. He did not go back to the loft. He sat in a chair by the cold hearth, watching over her as the moon made its slow journey across the sky. The air in the small cabin seemed charged, different. The space between them had changed. It was no longer just a man and the woman he had saved. There was a new awareness, a quiet intimacy forged in the darkness. He could hear the soft sound of her breathing, a fragile but steady presence in the room. He felt the phantom warmth of her body where she had leaned against him. the dampness of her tears on his shirt. It was not desire in the way a man usually knew it. It was something deeper, quieter, a recognition, a feeling of rightness in the simple act of breathing the same air, of weathering the same night, together. The night of tears changed something between them. A fragile wall, built of fear and uncertainty, had been washed away, leaving behind a raw and open space. When Cora emerged from the cabin the next morning, the hollow emptiness in her eyes had been replaced by a profound weariness, but also a flicker of something new, a resolve. She walked not to the woodpile or the water bucket, but to a fallow patch of earth near the creek where the soil was dark and rich. She stood there for a long time before Eli approached, stopping a respectful distance away. "I want to do something," she said, her voice quiet but clear. She did not look at him, but at the ground. "Something that grows." He understood immediately. He went to the barn and returned with a rusty spade and a hoe. He did not ask if she was strong enough. He did not offer to do it for her. He simply handed her the spade, its wooden handle worn smooth by Silas's hands. "The soil here is good," he said, his tone practical, instructive. "But you have to break it deep, turn it over, let it breathe." He showed her how to place her boot on the edge of the spade and use her weight to drive it into the stubborn, packed earth. She was clumsy at first, her movements jerky and uncertain. Her arms, thin and unused to such labor, trembled with the effort. But she did not stop. She worked with a grim determination, her jaw set, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Eli took up the hoe and worked alongside her, breaking up the large clods of earth she overturned. They did not speak. The only sounds were the scrape and thud of their tools, the cry of a hawk circling high overhead, and their own synchronized breathing. The sun climbed higher, beating down on their backs, and sweat traced clean paths through the dust on their skin. He watched her from the corner of his eye, saw the way she pushed through her exhaustion, her movements growing more fluid, more certain with each shovelful of earth. She was not just turning the soil, she was staking a claim, marking this small patch of the world as a place where she might begin again. They found a small, cloth sack of seeds in the cabin, beans and squash, hardy vegetables that could survive the harsh climate. Eli showed her how to poke shallow holes in the tilled rows and drop a single seed into each one. Her fingers, though calloused and bruised, were gentle as she handled the tiny, precious promises of life. When they were done, she stood and looked at the neat rows of disturbed earth, a sheen of sweat on her brow. For the first time, she looked directly at him, a question in her tired eyes. "Now we wait," he said simply. And they did. Every morning. It was the first place she went, carrying a bucket of water from the creek. She would pour it carefully over the soil, her expression a mixture of fierce hope and deep-seated doubt. Eli watched her daily pilgrimage, this quiet act of faith in a world that had given her every reason to lose it. Weeks passed. The rhythm of their life settled into one of shared work, while Cora tended her garden. Eli set about repairing the ranch. The corral fence was a wreck of splintered, rotting posts. He spent his days digging new post holes, felling young aspen trees, and stripping them for rails. Cora began to help him, at first just bringing him water, then holding a post steady while he tamped the earth around it, and eventually lifting the heavy rails with him. They learned to move together in a silent, efficient ballet. He would start to reach for a tool, and she would already be placing it in his hand. She would struggle with a heavy rock, and he would appear at her side to take the weight. They were two solitary people learning the language of partnership, a language spoken not with words, but with shared effort and mutual reliance. Their hands would sometimes brush, sending a jolt of awareness through them that was as potent as a spoken word. Glances were exchanged over the length of a fence rail, held for a moment too long, communicating a depth of feeling that neither of them was ready to name. The sweat and dust of their labor mixed on their skin, an earthy perfume of survival and creation. One morning, Cora went to her garden as usual. Eli was sharpening an axe by the barn when he heard a small, sharp intake of breath. He looked over and saw her kneeling in the dirt, absolutely still. He walked over slowly, not wanting to break the spell. She was staring at a tiny green shoot, 2 perfect leaves unfurling from the dark soil. As he watched, the corners of her mouth trembled, and then, for the first time since he had met her, she smiled. It was not a wide, happy grin. It was a small, fragile thing, a fleeting expression of pure, unadulterated wonder. But it transformed her face, chasing away the shadows and revealing a glimpse of the girl she had been. The sight of it struck Eli with the force of a physical blow, leaving him breathless. He felt a fierce, protective surge in his chest, a desire to guard that fragile smile from all the harshness of the world. He had seen many things in his life, beauty and terror, birth and death, but he knew, in that moment, that he had never seen anything as beautiful as Cora Bellamy's smile. The sky that afternoon began to turn a bruised, sickly yellow. The air grew heavy and still, the birds falling silent. Eli looked to the west and saw the clouds massing on the horizon, a roiling wall of dark gray. "A storm is coming," he said, his voice grim. "We need to get the animals into the barn." They worked quickly, herding the goat and Flint into the relative safety of the barn. By the time they finished, the wind had picked up, whipping Cora's hair across her face and rattling the loose shutter on the cabin window. The first drops of rain, fat and cold, began to fall. "Get inside," he told her, his hand on the small of her back, urging her toward the cabin. But as the first low rumble of thunder echoed through the valley, he felt her go rigid. She stopped dead, her head snapping up toward the darkening sky. "Cora?" he said, his voice sharp with concern. A flash of lightning split the sky, followed an instant later by a deafening crash of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. Cora cried out, a raw, terrified sound. She tore away from him, her eyes wide and unseeing, filled with a horror that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. She was not seeing the rain clouds, she was seeing smoke. She was not hearing thunder. She was hearing the roar of flames and the screams of her neighbors. "No," she whispered, backing away from the safety of the cabin. "No, no, no." Before Eli could stop her, she turned and ran. She did not run toward the barn or any form of shelter. She ran out into the open, away from the buildings, away from him, as if pursued by demons only she could see. "Cora!" he yelled, his voice lost in the rising howl of the wind. He ran after her, the rain now coming down in a blinding torrent. He followed her frantic, stumbling path away from the ranch, his heart pounding with a cold dread. The storm was breaking all around them, the world a chaotic symphony of wind, rain, and thunder. He found her at the edge of the creek, which was already beginning to swell. She had fallen and curled herself into a tight ball at the base of a large, gnarled cottonwood tree, her hands covering her head, her body shaking uncontrollably. He knelt beside her, soaked to the skin, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead. He reached out to touch her, but she flinched so violently that he drew his hand back. Her whimpers were barely audible over the roar of the storm. He knew he could not force her back to the cabin. In her mind, the enclosed space was a trap, a place of fire and death. So he did the only thing he could. He lowered himself to the ground, his back against the rough bark of the tree, and sat beside her. He did not speak. He did not touch her. He simply sat, a solid, unmoving presence in the heart of the tempest, and waited. The storm raged for hours. Night fell, but the darkness was constantly shattered by brilliant flashes of lightning. Eli sat through it all, his body growing cold and stiff, never taking his eyes off her. He was her guardian, her sentinel, a silent promise that she was not alone in her terror. Sometime deep in the night, the storm began to recede. The thunder softened to a distant grumble. the rain to a steady, gentle drumming on the leaves above them. In the quiet aftermath, her trembling slowly subsided. A long time passed. Then, her voice, small and broken, emerged from the darkness. "I thought no one would ever come," she whispered to the wet earth. It was an admission of the deepest despair, the belief that she had been utterly and finally abandoned in her moment of greatest need. Eli's throat was tight with a pain that was not his own. He thought of all the times he had wished someone had been there for May. He thought of his own failure. He chose his words carefully, knowing they held the power to either heal or break the fragile trust between them. "I did not come for you," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur against the sound of the rain. "I came with you." She grew still. He could feel the weight of his words settling over her. He was not a savior. He was not a hero riding to the rescue. He was just another soul walking the same hard road. A fellow traveler who had chosen to share her journey. Slowly, shakily, she uncurled. She sat up, her face pale and tear-streaked in the faint pre-dawn light. She looked at him, really looked at him, her gaze clear and direct for the first time. She saw the exhaustion etched on his face, the genuine compassion in his eyes. She saw a man who had sat with her in her private hell without judgment, without demands, without a word. She reached out a trembling hand and laid it on his arm. It was a simple, tentative gesture, but it was everything. It was acceptance. It was trust. He placed his own hand over hers. "Let us go home," he said softly. They walked back to the cabin as the sun began to rise, casting a clean, pale light over the rain-washed world. Inside, a small puddle had formed where the rain had driven through the cracks in the window shutter. Everything felt damp and cold. Eli built a fire in the hearth, the flames quickly chasing away the chill. Cora stood shivering, her wet dress clinging to her. "Get out of those wet clothes," he said, his voice gruff with concern. He turned his back to give her privacy, focusing on the fire. He heard her move, the soft sounds of her changing. He expected her to put on her other dress, the one she had painstakingly mended, but when he heard her small, hesitant voice call his name, he turned to see her standing wrapped in his spare wool shirt. It hung on her small frame, the sleeves rolled up, the hem falling to her knees. It was a garment of his, a piece of him, and she had chosen to wrap herself in it, in his scent, in his protection. Her own wet dress lay in a heap on the floor. Her skin was clean from the rain, her copper hair damp and dark. She looked vulnerable and yet, somehow, stronger than he had ever seen her. The space between them, which had been charged with silent understanding in the corral, now crackled with a new, unspoken tension. It was a feeling so potent, so fragile, it felt as though the slightest movement might shatter it. "You should sleep," he said, his voice huskier than he intended. She nodded and went to her cot, pulling the blanket around her shoulders over his shirt. She did not lie down immediately. She sat there, watching him. He pulled a chair over and sat near her bed, a silent guardian once more. They did not speak. They did not touch, but in the quiet warmth of the firelit cabin, every held breath, every subtle shift in the shadows, was a conversation. The air was thick with all the things they could not say, all the feelings they did not dare to name. It was a moment of profound intimacy, a recognition of the deep, unbreakable bond that had been forged between them in the heart of a storm. The next day, a rider from a neighboring ranch stopped by, seeking shelter from a sudden downpour. He shared his news as he dried himself by their fire. "They are looking for a girl," he said, oblivious to the sudden tension in the room. "Some runaway contract girl from down in the territory. A big rancher named Abernathy put a bounty on her. $100. A few bounty hunters passed through yesterday, asking questions. Hard-looking men." Eli's face became a mask of cold stone. He thanked the man for the information, his movements calm and deliberate. But a dangerous light had entered his eyes. After the rider left, he went to the corner where he kept his rifle. He began to clean it with slow, methodical movements. The oily click of the mechanism, the only sound in the cabin. He was preparing for a fight. He was ready to kill to protect her, to protect this fragile piece they had built. Cora watched him, her heart sinking with a new kind of fear. She had seen enough violence, enough death, to last a lifetime. She could not bear the thought of more blood being shed in her name. She walked over to him and placed a hand on his arm, stopping his movements. He looked up, his eyes hard and unforgiving. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. "Eli, no, do not kill again for me." Eli's plea did not stop the inevitable. He could no more halt the coming trouble than he could command the sun not to set. They had 2 days of a fragile, watchful peace. And then they came. They arrived at midday. 3 riders cresting the hill and moving down into the valley with the lazy confidence of predators that have their prey cornered. They were not lawmen. They were hard-looking men with mercenary eyes, the kind who lived by the gun and the bounty poster. Eli saw them from the barn. His body went still, every muscle tensing. "Cora," he said, his voice a low command. "Go inside the cabin. Bar the door. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." She saw the look on his face, a cold, flat finality that chilled her to the bone. Her own fear was a rising tide, but she nodded, her throat too tight for words. She ran to the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs, and slid the heavy wooden bar across the door. She peered through a small crack in the shutter, her hands pressed against the rough wood. Eli did not take cover. He walked out into the middle of the yard, his rifle held loosely in one hand, and waited. The 3 riders fanned out as they approached, their horses kicking up dust. The man in the center, a burly figure with a scar that cut through one eyebrow, was clearly the leader. "That is far enough," Eli called out, his voice carrying in the still air. The leader pulled his horse to a halt, a mocking smirk on his face. "We are looking for a piece of property, a runaway contract girl. Answers to the name of Cora. We have a poster here says she belongs to a Mr. Abernathy down in the territory. We mean to collect her, and the $100 bounty on her head." "She is not property," Eli said, his voice dangerously calm. "And she is not going anywhere." The leader chuckled, a humorless, ugly sound. "I see. So you are the fella who thinks he can just buy a girl with a rusty gun belt. Word travels? Listen, friend, we do not want any trouble. Just give us the girl, and we will ride out. Maybe we will even forget to mention your part in this to the circuit judge." Eli knew negotiation was a fool's errand, but he had to try. For Cora, he could not bring another firefight to her doorstep. She has been through enough. Let her be. I do not have much, but what I have is yours if you ride away now. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the few coins he had left from selling a spare saddle blanket in a town a week back. It was a pathetic sum. He tossed it into the dust at their feet. The leader looked down at the coins, then back at Eli, and roared with laughter. His companions joined in. "That is your offer? That would not buy me a decent bottle of whiskey." He spat into the dust near the coins. "You are a fool. You got nothing, and we are going to take the girl." He glanced past Eli, toward the cabin, his eyes narrowing with a lecherous glint as he caught a flicker of movement at the window. A cruel smile spread across his face. "Tell you what," the man sneered, "after we collect our $100 for her, maybe I will keep her for a few days myself. Break her in proper, a quiet one like that. I bet she could learn to scream." Something inside Eli snapped. The cold control he held so tightly shattered into a million pieces of pure, white-hot rage. He did not think. He moved. In a blur of motion, he dropped his rifle, took 3 long strides forward, and threw a punch with all the force of his body behind it. His knuckles connected with the bounty hunter's jaw with a sickening crack that echoed in the yard. The man's head snapped to the side, and he tumbled from his saddle like a sack of grain, unconscious before he hit the ground. The other two men stared in stunned disbelief for a second, and that second was all Eli needed. He lunged for the second man, grabbing him by the leg and hauling him from his horse. They crashed to the ground together in a tangle of limbs. The man was strong, and he drove an elbow into Eli's ribs, forcing a grunt of pain. Eli answered with a fist to the man's temple. The third rider, recovering his wits, drew his pistol. Cora screamed from behind the shutter, a sound of pure terror. Eli heard it, and a desperate, primal strength surged through him. He could not die here. He could not leave her alone. He shoved the man he was grappling with into the path of the horse, causing the animal to rear in panic. The third rider's shot went wild, splintering the top rail of the corral fence. Eli scrambled to his feet. The second man was coming at him now, a long hunting knife gleaming in his hand. Eli backed away, his eyes darting for a weapon. Anything. He ripped a loose rail from the fence, the wood splintering in his hands. He used it as a club, swinging it in a wide, desperate arc. The bounty hunter ducked, but the heavy wood caught him on the shoulder, drawing a howl of pain and rage. The man lunged, the knife flashing. Eli twisted, but the blade sliced across his forearm, a searing line of fire. He ignored the pain, bringing the heavy rail down again, this time connecting squarely with the man's head. The man crumpled to the ground, moaning. One left, the rider with the gun. He had his horse under control now and was taking aim, his face a mask of fury. There was no time. Eli threw the fence rail like a spear. It was a clumsy, desperate move, but it was enough. The rail struck the horse in the flank, and the animal screamed and bolted, unseating its rider. Eli did not wait. He charged forward, his vision blurring at the edges from the pain in his arm and ribs. He fell upon the last man as he was struggling to his feet, and the fight devolved into a brutal, rolling brawl in the dust. Fists flew, connecting with flesh and bone. The man was bigger, but Eli was fueled by a fury that bordered on madness. He was fighting for more than his life. He was fighting for the fragile smile he had seen in a garden, for the quiet trust of a hand on his arm in the dead of night. He landed a final, desperate blow to the man's throat. The bounty hunter gagged, his eyes wide with shock and pain, and scrambled away, crawling backward in the dirt like a crab. He got to his feet, stumbled over to his dazed companion, and hauled him onto a horse. The leader still lay unconscious on the ground. They left him there, galloping away in a cloud of dust and curses, defeated not by a gunslinger, but by a ferocity they had not expected and could not comprehend. Eli stood swaying in the middle of the yard, his chest heaving. Blood dripped from his arm, and a deep, agonizing pain flared in his side with every breath. He watched them go, then turned and took a staggering step toward the cabin before his legs gave out from under him. He collapsed to his knees, the world spinning into a dark, roaring tunnel. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the cabin door being thrown open and Cora running toward him, her face a pale mask of terror. When he came to, he was on his cot inside the cabin. The world swam back into focus slowly, painfully. He was aware of a cool, damp cloth on his forehead and a gentle, insistent pressure on his arm. He looked down and saw Cora, her face set with a grim concentration he had never seen before. She was stitching the long, deep gash on his forearm with a needle and thread from her sewing kit, her hands trembling but her movements surprisingly steady. She had cut away the sleeve of his shirt. The wound was raw and angry, but her stitches were small and neat. He saw the empty whiskey bottle on the floor beside her and realized she had used it to clean the wound. "Cora," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. She started, her head snapping up. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of fear and relief. "Eli, you are awake." "The other one," he managed, the words a struggle. "The one I hit." "He is gone," she said. "He woke up and stumbled away while you were—" While you were sleeping. He tried to sit up, but a blinding pain in his ribs shot through him, and he fell back with a groan, a wave of blackness washing over him. "Lie still," she commanded, her voice surprisingly firm. She put a hand on his chest to keep him down. "You are hurt, badly." He surrendered, his body too broken to argue. He watched her through half-closed eyes as she finished stitching his arm. She worked in silence, her brow furrowed. When she was done, she tore a strip of clean cloth from her own petticoat and bandaged the wound tightly. Then her gaze moved to his torso. His shirt was soaked with blood, not just from his arm, but from somewhere else. She hesitated for only a moment. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, with trembling fingers, she began to unbutton his shirt. It was an act of profound, terrifying intimacy. She had never seen a man undressed, but this was not about seduction. It was about healing. It was a duty she could not shirk. She peeled the blood-soaked fabric away from his skin. His chest and ribs were a canvas of angry, swelling bruises, a testament to the brutal kicks he had taken. A smaller, jagged cut oozed blood just below his ribs. She cleaned this one, too, her touch as gentle as she could make it. She saw him flinch, his jaw clenching, but he did not make a sound. As she worked, she saw the scars that littered his body, old wounds from a life of violence he never spoke of. Each scar was a story, a ghost of a past she could only imagine. For the first time, she saw him not as the silent, unbreachable protector, but as a vulnerable, mortal man who had been broken in his defense of her. The realization filled her with a fierce, aching tenderness that was almost painful. When she was finished, she covered him with a blanket. His breathing was shallow, his face pale with pain. She knew he needed more than her clumsy ministrations. She went to his saddlebags and rummaged through them until she found a small, dark blue bottle filled with a thick, syrupy liquid. Laudanum, a powerful tincture of morphine for pain. She poured a small dose into a spoon, her hand shaking so badly she nearly spilled it. She brought it to his lips. "Take this," she whispered. "It will help you sleep." He obeyed without question, swallowing the bitter liquid. She sat in the chair beside his cot, watching as the drug slowly took hold, smoothing the lines of pain from his face and pulling him down into a deep, oblivious sleep. She sat with him through the long hours of the night, the only light from the low fire in the hearth. She watched the steady, if shallow, rise and fall of his chest. He was alive. He had fought for her. He had won. But she knew this was not the end. The bounty hunters would be back. They would bring more men. Hiding here was no longer an option. They would be hunted, and next time, Eli might not be able to stand against them. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. He looked so pale, so broken, lying there. The world had taken everyone she had ever loved. Her father, her mother, her brother, Samuel. They had all been taken from her, leaving her utterly alone. She could not bear for him to be next. She leaned close to him, her breath warm against his ear, and whispered the deepest fear of her heart into the quiet room. "Do not leave me like the others." As dawn broke, painting the sky in pale shades of gray and rose, a new resolve had taken root in her soul. She would not be a victim. She would not hide and wait for the end. She had a weapon, one she had not used in a long time, her voice, her truth. She found an old, leather-bound ledger in the trunk where she had found the sewing kit. Most of the pages were filled with Silas's accounts of feed and livestock, but the last few were blank. She found a pen and a small, dried-out inkwell. She mixed a little water into the inkwell until it was dark and fluid. Then she began to write. She wrote to Sheriff Brody. Her hand was stiff and unpracticed, the letters shaky at first. But then the words came, a torrent of truth she had held inside for too long. She wrote about the auction in Tinder Creek, describing the back room of the saloon in stark detail. She named the auctioneer. She named the man with the piggish face who had tried to buy her for $3. She named the other men she remembered, describing their faces, their cruel laughter. She told him of the lie of the indenture contracts, of how they were used to traffic in the lives of the desperate and the lost. She wrote not as a victim pleading for help, but as a witness demanding justice. When she was done, she paused, the pen hovering over the bottom of the page. Then, with a steady, defiant stroke, she signed her full name, Cora Bellamy. It was an act of reclamation. She was no longer a nameless, silent girl. She was herself again. She knew they could not stay at the ranch. She had to get Eli somewhere safe. She spent the morning packing what little they had, food, water, blankets, and the last of the laudanum. Getting Eli onto Flint was an agonizing ordeal. He was barely conscious, a dead weight against her, groaning in pain with every movement. But she managed, her slight frame fueled by a desperate strength. She led the horse away from the ranch, away from the small garden with its precious green shoots, and into the rugged, rocky canyons that bordered the valley. She found a shallow, hidden cave, screened by a thick growth of juniper. It was not much, but it was defensible, and out of sight. For 3 days, she cared for him there. She brought him water from a small, clear spring. She kept a fire burning at the mouth of the cave. She talked to him, her voice a low, constant murmur, telling him stories of her childhood, of the lilacs, of her brother, as if her words alone could tether him to the world of the living. But he was not getting better. He was getting worse. A fever took hold of him, leaving him drenched in sweat one moment and shivering with cold the next. He became delirious, muttering names she did not know, May, and fighting against phantom enemies. She checked the wound on his arm. It was hot to the touch, the skin around the stitches an angry, inflamed red. An infection was spreading through him, poisoning him from the inside out. The laudanum was gone, and his pain was immense. On the 4th morning, she knew he was dying. She looked at his pale, feverish face, listened to his ragged breathing, and a terrible choice settled upon her. She could stay here and watch him die, or she could risk everything to save him. She made her decision. She bathed his face with cool water one last time. "I will be back, Eli," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his hot forehead. "I promise." She left him there, in the quiet of the cave, and climbed onto Flint. She rode out of the canyon, not with fear, but with a cold, hard purpose. She rode toward town, toward the law, toward the man who had looked at her with suspicion and disdain. She pushed Flint harder than she ever had before. The letter to the sheriff tucked safely inside her dress, a fragile declaration of war against the world that had tried to silence her. She arrived in the county seat caked in dust, her face grim, her eyes burning with intensity. She walked straight into the sheriff's office without knocking. Sheriff Brody looked up from his paperwork, his eyes widening in surprise. "You," he said. Cora did not waste time with pleasantries. She walked to his desk, pulled the folded letter from her dress, and laid it before him. "Read this," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. He looked at her, then down at the letter. He unfolded it and began to read. She watched his face, saw his expression shift from curiosity to surprise, and then to a grim, stony anger. He read it once, and then a second time, more slowly. When he was finished, he looked up at her, and she saw something new in his eyes. The suspicion was gone, replaced by a grudging respect. "This is a mighty serious accusation, Miss Bellamy," he said, his voice quiet. "It is the truth," she answered. "The man you came to see, Eli Granger. He is dying. He fought the men who came for me. He is hiding in a canyon west of here. He needs a doctor, and I need justice." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, stroking his chin. He was a man caught between the written law and the unwritten rules of the territory. He looked at the determined, courageous young woman standing before him, a woman who had ridden into the lion's den armed only with the truth. He was shaken, not just by the contents of her letter, but by the raw courage it had taken for her to bring it to him. He stood up, his decision made. "I will send for the doctor and ride out with him myself. We will bring Granger back here, where he can be tended to." He paused, his gaze hardening. "But you understand what this means. This letter, it forces my hand. I will have to open an official inquiry. There will be a trial, for the men you named, and for Eli too, for the violence he committed. And you will have to testify. In open court, it will not be easy." "I am not afraid anymore," Cora said, and she knew, as she said it, that it was true. The sheriff nodded slowly. "All right then, Miss Bellamy, let us go see about your man." The jail cell was not a place of punishment, but a sanctuary. Sheriff Brody, in a gesture of gruff compassion, had cleared it out and allowed the town doctor to turn it into a makeshift infirmary. For 2 weeks, it was Eli's world, a small, square room that smelled of lye soap, iron bars, and the medicinal herbs the doctor prescribed. And for 2 weeks, it was Cora's world, too. She never left his side. During the day, she sat in a straight-backed wooden chair, her hands busy mending his clothes or tearing clean linen for bandages. She spoon-fed him thin broth when he was too weak to lift his head, her touch gentle, her movements efficient. At night, when the rest of the town slept, she remained. She would doze in the chair, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, waking at his slightest stir or feverish moan. She bathed his face with cool water, changed the dressing on his arm, and sometimes, when the pain seemed to overwhelm him in his sleep, she would read to him in a low, soft whisper. She had found a worn Bible in the sheriff's office, and she read from the Psalms, the ancient words of comfort, a balm not only for him, but for her own frayed soul. Eli drifted in and out of consciousness, caught in a fevered haze of pain and memory. He saw flashes of the fight, the sneer on the bounty hunter's face, the terror in Cora's eyes. He saw May's face, her smile fading into smoke. But through it all, one constant presence anchored him to the living world. Cora. He was aware of her scent, a clean, simple scent of soap and wood smoke. He felt the cool relief of her hand on his forehead. He heard the soft murmur of her voice, a lifeline in the darkness. When the fever finally broke, he woke to find her asleep in the chair, her head resting on the edge of his cot, her hand loosely holding his, her face, in the pale light of dawn filtering through the barred window, looked exhausted but peaceful. He was weak, his body a map of aches and pains, but his mind was clear for the first time in days. He looked at the woman who had fought for him, who had ridden for help, who had not left his side, and a feeling so profound it stole his breath washed over him. He had stumbled into that saloon seeking vengeance for a ghost, and had found, instead, a reason to live. He gently squeezed her hand. Her eyes fluttered open, at first clouded with sleep, then clearing with a sudden, sharp relief. "Eli," she breathed, her voice thick with sleep. "You came back for me," he said, his own voice a rough, unused croak. A small, weary smile touched her lips. "I promised." The trial was set for a month after Eli's recovery began. By then, he was able to walk, albeit with a stiffness in his side and a new, deep scar on his forearm to add to his collection. The circuit judge, a stern, hawk-nosed man named Elias Thorne, arrived on the morning train, and the town buzzed with an energy that was part anticipation, part morbid curiosity. The courtroom was packed to the rafters. Ranchers stood in the back, their hats in their hands. The town merchants and their wives filled the benches, their faces a mixture of judgment and intrigue. Sheriff Brody stood near the door, his expression grim and unreadable. Cora, sitting in the front row, saw the men from Tinder Creek huddled together on the far side of the room, their faces slick with sweat, their eyes darting about nervously. And then she saw him, an old man with a fringe of white hair and a kind, weathered face, dressed in the simple black coat of a country preacher. It was Reverend Miller, a friend of her father's from a neighboring circuit. He caught her eye and gave a small, encouraging nod. The sight of a familiar, friendly face in this sea of strangers was a sudden, unexpected comfort, and tears pricked at the back of her eyes. The proceedings began. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced man from the territorial capital, laid out the case in cold, legal terms. Eli Granger stood accused of aggravated assault against 3 men. Cora Bellamy, a runaway, was the property of a Mr. Abernathy, held under a legally binding indenture contract. The case, he argued, was simple. When it was Cora's turn to testify, a hush fell over the room. She walked to the witness stand, her legs trembling, her hands clammy. She sat, her back straight, and looked out at the sea of faces. She saw the whispers, the sideways glances. She felt the weight of their judgment. Then she looked at Eli. He sat beside his court-appointed lawyer, his face calm, his eyes fixed on her. In his gaze, she found not pity, but an unshakable faith. It was all the strength she needed. "Please state your full name for the record," the prosecutor said, his tone dismissive. "Cora Bellamy." Her voice was a tremor, but it was clear. "And Miss Bellamy, is it true that you willingly signed an indenture contract with Mr. Abernathy?" "No, sir," she said, her voice growing stronger. "It is not true." She began to tell her story. She spoke of her father's church, of the raid, of the fire, and then she spoke of what came after. She told them about the men who had promised salvation and delivered them to a living hell. She described the back room of the saloon in Tinder Creek, the smell of stale beer and greed, the auctioneer's cruel smirk. "They called it a sale of labor," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "But it was not. They were selling people. They were selling what was left of us after the outlaws had taken everything else." The prosecutor jumped to his feet. "Objection! The witness is speculating, using inflammatory language." "Sustained," the judge said, his eyes on Cora. "Stick to the facts. Miss Bellamy—" She took a shaky breath and continued. She pointed to the men from Tinder Creek. "That man," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound power. "He bid $3 for me. He called me damaged goods for the whole room to hear." A gasp went through the crowd. The man she indicated shrank in his seat, his face turning a blotchy red. "Objection!" the prosecutor shouted. "Overruled," the judge said, his voice sharp. "Let her speak." Cora's testimony poured out of her then, a flood of truth that could no longer be contained. She was interrupted. She was insulted. The prosecutor questioned her character, implying she was a woman of loose morals, that she had enticed Eli into violence. But she did not stop. Every time he tried to silence her, she would pause, look the judge squarely in the eye, and continue. She spoke for the other girls, the ones who had been sold before her, the ones with no one to speak for them. She was no longer just a victim. She was a witness, a voice for the voiceless. By the time she finished, she was weeping openly, but her head was held high. The courtroom was utterly silent, the air thick with the weight of her testimony. When Eli was called to the stand, his testimony was the mirror opposite of hers. It was short, stark, and unadorned. "Mr. Granger," his lawyer asked, "why did you assault those men?" Eli stood tall, the scars on his face and arm a testament to the violence he had both endured and committed. He did not look at the judge or the jury of ranchers. He looked only at Cora. "I did not assault them," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I stopped them." "And why did you feel the need to do that?" Eli refused to defend himself, to offer excuses or justifications. To do so would be to admit that what he had done was a crime. He simply stated the truth as he knew it. "I saved her," he said, his gaze locked with Cora's. "Because I had to." That was all he would say. The prosecutor pressed him, trying to paint him as a violent drifter. a lawless man. But Eli remained silent, his simple, powerful statement hanging in the air, an undeniable testament to a moral code that transcended the written law. The judge delivered his verdict that afternoon. His voice boomed through the silent courtroom. He declared the practice of indenture auctions, as they were being conducted in the territory, to be a form of illegal trafficking, a violation of both federal and moral law. He reprimanded Sheriff Brody for allowing such a thing to fester in his jurisdiction, though he stopped short of accusing him of complicity. He ordered the men from Tinder Creek to be investigated. Then he turned to Eli. "Mr. Granger," he said, his hawk-like eyes stern, "you took the law into your own hands. This court cannot and does not condone vigilantism. However," he paused, looking from Eli to Cora, a flicker of understanding in his gaze. "Given the extraordinary circumstances and the testimony of Miss Bellamy, this court finds that your actions, while illegal, were not without merit. You are sentenced to the time you have already served. You are a free man." A wave of relief so powerful it left her dizzy washed over Cora. It was over. They were free. As the courtroom erupted in a buzz of conversation, Reverend Miller made his way over to her, his kind eyes shining. "Your father would have been so proud of you, my child," he said, taking her hand. But as they left the courthouse, the victory began to feel hollow. The whispers followed them down the wooden sidewalk. "That is her, the ruined girl." Imagine testifying like that in public. No shame. And him, a drifter and a brawler. What kind of life can they have? They are not fit for a proper marriage. Not after all this. Each whispered word was like a sharp stone striking her. She had won her freedom in the eyes of the law, but in the court of public opinion, she was still damaged goods. She looked at Eli, walking beside her, his head held high, ignoring the stares and the murmurs. He had given up everything for her. He had nearly died for her. He was a good, honorable man, and she had tied him to her own brokenness. He deserved a clean slate, a good woman, a life free from the shadow of her past. He deserved better than her. That night, a decision, cold and hard as a river stone, settled in her heart. She would leave. It was the only way to truly set him free. She waited until he was asleep. She packed a small cloth bag with the few things she owned, her other dress, the worn comb, the Bible the Reverend had given her. She wrote him a short, tear-blotted note, leaving it on the table. "You gave me back my life. Now go and live yours. You deserve peace. I will never forget you." She slipped out of the small room they had rented and made her way through the deserted streets to the train station. The moon was high and bright, casting long, lonely shadows. The early morning train, the one heading east, was due in an hour. She bought a ticket with the last of the money the Reverend had pressed into her hand. She sat on a hard wooden bench on the empty platform, her small bag at her feet, and waited, a hollow ache in her chest. The distant whistle of the train sounded, a mournful cry in the darkness. She stood up, her heart pounding. This was it. This was the right thing to do. The train's headlamp appeared, a single bright eye cutting through the night. "Cora!" His voice came from the shadows behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Eli stood there, leaning against the station wall for support. He was not wearing a coat, only his shirt and trousers. He looked tired, and the moonlight made his face seem pale and drawn. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, clutching her bag. "I woke up," he said simply, pushing himself off the wall and walking slowly toward her. The room was cold. "You were gone." "You should not be out of bed," she said, her voice choked with tears. "You are not strong enough." "I am strong enough for this," he said, stopping a few feet from her. The train was getting closer, the rumble of its wheels growing louder. "Where are you going?" "Away," she said, looking down at her shoes. "It is better this way. For you. People are talking. I will not have you tied to a To a ruined girl. He reached out and took her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. Look at me, Cora. She reluctantly raised her eyes to his. His gaze was fierce, intense. I did not buy you to lose you, he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. The train was pulling into the station now, its brakes hissing, steam billowing around them. The world was a chaotic roar of noise and motion, but in that moment, all she could see was him. He did not say he loved her. The words were too small for what lay between them. Instead, he dropped to one knee on the dusty platform. It was not a gesture of supplication, but of profound, humble offering. He did not pull out a ring. He reached into his pocket and brought out a small, worn leather pouch. He held it out to her on the palm of his hand. It was the small pouch of seeds they had planted in her garden. The bounty hunters trampled most of the garden, he said, his voice nearly lost in the noise of the train. But I went back. I saved what I could. He looked up at her, his eyes shining in the lamplight, and offered her not a past of wealth and ease, but a future of shared struggle and creation. I have nothing, Cora, nothing but a broken-down ranch and a handful of seeds. But if you will stay, if you will do me the honor of staying, we will grow something from nothing, together. Tears streamed down her face, hot and cleansing. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a joy so deep it was painful. She looked at the man kneeling before her, offering her a future in the palm of his hand. She looked at the pouch of seeds, a promise of life, of hope, of new beginnings. And she knew, with an absolute certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was home. She reached out and laid her hand over his, her tears falling onto the worn leather pouch, baptizing the seeds of their future. The train whistle faded into the vast, open silence of the plains, leaving behind only the promise it represented. They did not take it. Instead, they returned to the valley, to the broken-down ranch that was both their inheritance and their future. The land, washed clean by the storm, waited for them. The months that followed were measured not in days or weeks, but in small, hard-won victories. They began with the seeds. Cora knelt in the trampled, muddy earth of her garden and, with a patience that was almost a prayer, planted the seeds Eli had saved. She weeded and watered, her hands becoming calloused, her face browned by the sun. When the first new sprouts pushed their way toward the light, she did not smile as she had before. This was a deeper feeling, a quiet, fierce satisfaction. It was the feeling of resurrection. Eli, his body slowly mending, worked with a steady, relentless purpose. He finished the corral, the new aspen rails pale and strong against the older, weathered wood. He rethatched the roof of the barn, patched the chinking in the cabin walls, and replaced the broken shutter that had rattled in the storm. Every swing of his hammer was a nail in the coffin of his old, wandering life. Every board he set in place was a foundation for a new one. They were rebuilding the ranch, but it was more than that. Seed by seed, board by board, they were rebuilding themselves. The woman who had arrived in a torn, soiled dress disappeared. In her place was a woman who wore simple, soft cotton dresses she had sewn herself. The hollow-eyed girl who had been afraid to speak was replaced by a woman who hummed softly as she worked. She baked bread in a small stone oven Eli built for her, and the warm, yeasty scent filled the cabin, turning it from a shelter into a home. It was the smell of life, of sustenance, of simple, profound peace. In the evenings, after the work was done, she would often sit at the small wooden table with a piece of charcoal and a scrap of old newspaper. At first, Eli thought she was practicing her letters, but one night, he saw the words she was forming, not in straight lines, but in stanzas. They were not poems of sorrow or loss. They were poems about the color of the sky at dusk, the resilience of a single wildflower growing in the crack of a rock, the quiet strength in a man's hands. She was finding her voice again, not in the loud declaration of a courtroom, but in the quiet beauty of a world she was learning to trust once more. Their intimacy was a slow, cautious bloom, as tentative and as precious as the first seedlings in her garden. Eli never pushed, never presumed. The brutal world had taken enough from her. He would not take anything she did not offer freely. His respect for her was a tangible thing. A quiet space he created around her where she could feel safe. Their life was one of shared space and separate beds, a silent understanding that healing had its own timetable. The first time he kissed her, it was she who began it. They had been working all day, hauling river stones to create a proper foundation for the porch. They were both exhausted, covered in a fine layer of dust and sweat. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the valley, she had reached up and gently wiped a smudge of dirt from his cheek. Her touch lingered, her fingers soft against his rough skin. He stood perfectly still, his heart hammering in his chest, waiting. She looked into his eyes, and in their depths, she saw not hunger or demand, but a quiet, patient devotion. She leaned in and pressed her lips to his. It was not a kiss of passion, but of gratitude. It was soft, hesitant, and as profound as a vow. He did not deepen it. He simply accepted the gift, his hand coming up to gently cup her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. When she pulled away, they stood in the deepening twilight, the unspoken truth of their feelings finally acknowledged, a fragile bridge built between them. From then on, he would kiss her only when she reached for him first, a silent ritual of consent that honored the sanctity of her choice. Some nights, they would take a blanket and lie in the tall grass outside the cabin, watching the stars ignite in the vast, dark sky. The universe felt immense, their own troubles small and distant. They rarely spoke during these times. There was no need. They would lie in a comfortable silence, their shoulders sometimes touching, their breaths falling into a shared rhythm. Sometimes, she would tentatively reach for his hand, her fingers lacing with his, and they would stay that way for hours. Two small, solitary souls finding solace in the simple, profound comfort of another's presence. It was a communion that went deeper than words, a quiet knitting together of two lives that had been frayed and torn. One afternoon, a wagon appeared on the road that led to the valley. It was a rare enough sight to make them both stop their work. As it drew closer, Cora recognized the woman holding the reins. It was Martha Gable, a widow from town whose husband had been a decent, well-respected blacksmith. Martha had sat in the courtroom during the trial, her expression one of deep, sorrowful empathy. She pulled the wagon to a stop and smiled a warm, genuine smile. "I hope I am not intruding," she said, her voice practical and kind. "I brought you some flour and a few jars of my peach preserves." Cora, still wary of strangers, felt herself relax in the woman's presence. "That is very kind of you. Mrs. Gable, please, come and sit for a while." They sat on the newly finished porch while Eli tended to the widow's horse. Martha did not engage in idle gossip. She came straight to the point. "I was in the courtroom, Cora," she said, her gaze direct. "I heard what you said. I saw your courage. It moved me. It made me think." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "This is a hard land, especially for women. My husband, he was a good man, but not all are. There are girls in this county, young women, trapped in situations with no way out. Some are indentured, like you were. Others are just stuck, with cruel fathers or husbands. They have no money, no family to turn to, no voice." She looked at Cora, her eyes shining with a fierce purpose. "What you did in that courtroom, you gave them a voice. You gave them hope. But hope is not enough. They need a place to go, a refuge." Cora listened, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. She knew, better than anyone, the truth of the widow's words. "I am not a rich woman," Martha continued, "but my husband left me the old smithy and the house attached to it. It is empty now. It is big enough. I have some savings. I want to turn it into a shelter, a place where a woman can come and be safe. Learn a trade, get back on her feet. But I cannot do it alone. I am just a blacksmith's widow. They need someone to look up to. Someone who understands, someone who has walked through the fire and come out the other side. She leaned forward, her hands clasped together. They need you. Cora, I need you to help me. The offer hung in the air, immense and terrifying. It meant leaving the safety of the valley. It meant facing the whispers and the stares of the townspeople again. It meant revisiting the darkest parts of her own past, over and over, to help others navigate theirs. It was a tremendous weight to bear. She looked out at the valley, at the sturdy corral Eli had built, at the small patch of green that was her garden. This was her sanctuary. The thought of leaving it, even for a day, sent a ripple of fear through her. But then she thought of the other girls, the ones who had no valley to run to, no quiet, steady man to stand with them. She thought of their silent, desperate faces. Her own suffering had been a pointless, cruel thing. But if she could use it, if she could turn that pain into a shield for others, then it would not have been in vain. It would have a meaning. She turned back to Martha, and the fear in her eyes was replaced by a calm, unshakable resolve. It was her first true act of public strength since the trial, a decision made not for her own survival, but for the survival of others. Yes, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I will help you. A few weeks later, Cora woke one morning to an unfamiliar sound. It was early, the sun just beginning to crest the hills, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. The sound was a rhythmic, scraping noise, followed by a solid, definitive thud. It came from a small, secluded grove of cottonwood trees down by the creek. Curiosity piqued. She slipped out of the cabin. Eli was not in the loft. She followed the sound, the cool morning dew dampening the hem of her dress. As she drew closer, she saw him. He was working with a focus so intense he did not hear her approach. He was clearing the small grove, arranging river stones into a low, neat foundation. Beside him was a pile of scrap lumber, pieces he had salvaged from the old, collapsed section of the barn. She watched him for a long time, her heart swelling with a feeling she could not name. He was not building a woodshed or another pen for the animals. The foundation was small, the shape of it distinct. He was building a chapel. It was not a grand structure. It was humble, made of reclaimed wood and stones pulled from the creek bed. But it was a perfect, beautiful thing. It was a tribute to the preacher who had raised her, a quiet acknowledgement of the faith that had been stolen from her and that she was slowly, tentatively, rediscovering in the quiet moments of her new life. Eli, the man who never spoke of God, who seemed to hold his own counsel with the sky and the mountains, was building her a place to pray. He had seen the Bible by her bed. He had heard her whisper the Psalms to him in his fever. He understood a part of her soul she had thought was lost forever, and he was giving it a home. She did not interrupt him. She slipped away as quietly as she had come. A week later, he told her he had something to show her. He led her down the path to the grove. The structure was finished. It was a small, one-room chapel, with a simple, sturdy door and a single window that looked out over the creek. The afternoon sun streamed through it, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Inside, there was a single wooden bench and a small, flat-topped stone that served as an altar. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She walked into the chapel, her hand trailing along the rough-hewn wood of the wall. She turned to Eli, who stood in the doorway, his face uncertain, as if he feared he had overstepped a boundary. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. She left him there and walked a little way down the creek bank, where a patch of wild bluebells grew. She picked a single, perfect stem and returned to the chapel. She walked to the stone altar and placed the wildflower upon it, a small offering of color and life in the quiet, sacred space. Then, She turned to Eli and took his large, calloused hand in both of hers. She looked up at him, her heart so full of love it felt as though it might break. She thought of his desperate bid in that filthy saloon, the life he had wagered for a stranger. She thought of his patience, his gentleness, his quiet, unshakable strength. He had saved her body, her mind, and now, her soul. "You gave your life for me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She squeezed his hand, a silent promise, a final, complete surrender to the love that had healed her. "Now I want the rest of it." He did not speak. He did not need to. His answer was in the way his eyes shone, in the way his hand tightened around hers, in the gentle smile that finally, completely, erased the last of the shadows from his face. The next morning, they rode into town together on Flint. They were not headed to the courthouse or to the train station. They were going to Martha's to begin the work on the shelter, and then to the general store to buy supplies for the ranch. They rode not as outcasts, not as a runaway girl and the violent drifter who had claimed her. The whispers still followed them, but they no longer had the power to wound. They rode tall, their shoulders back, their face turned toward the future. They were something much harder to break than the world imagined. They were survivors, partners, builders. They were survivors in love. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can all connect. Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel, and do not forget to share your thoughts in English.